I've come to the Rennsteig in the Thuringian forest, which used to be the border between Thuringia and Hessen. I've taken a little detour. I've come to Oberhof. It's a couple of 100 meters here from the Rennsteig. This is also a very popular area for winter sports. There's skiing behind me. There's also sledding over there. My own kids are sledding right now.
It's as good a place as any to come for a follow-up to the last episode and consider Frege's legacy, not only to the world of mathematics and logic, but also to aesthetics and, in particular, the fourth movement of my string quartet. Despite appearances, Frege did not work entirely in isolation up until the famous postcard. Quite the opposite. He was part of a new movement oriented on realism and that had more interest in scientific naturalism and empirical knowledge than the work of Nietzsche and the idealist tradition. One of the leading figures of this naturalist approach was Ernst Haeckel, who was a contemporary of Frege at the University of Jena. He was a biologist and a zoologist. He discovered and named many species and associated terms, including ecology, anthropogeny, and stem cell. He was also well known for his drawings of a detailed genealogical tree showing all known life forms.
I've come to the Villa Medusa, which is also home to the Heckel Museum. There's also now part of the Institute for the History of Medicine, Natural Science and Technology, which is a part of the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. It's also where Haeckel used to live, and it's now his museum inside, and there are many artifacts in there pertaining to his life and times. Let's go and take a look.
Yes, okay. So what you see there is one of Haeckel's trees. It comes from his work Generelle Morphologie, and it shows in one picture, one tree, the development from the moneas, that are very little organisms, to the mane. And Haeckel was famous for this because when Darwin in his work at first time he has only one sentence to the mane, and Haeckel found this is not enough. So in 1866 he tried to put everything together in one main kind table. I do not know how to spell it right. It's a tree for the man, and it starts with everything Haeckel has meant to mention for the development. So it's phylogenese there. You have the relationship between organisms. You see there's the monas, the amoeben, and it's getting more complex when you're getting up, and on the top of the tree you will find the man standing over the gorilla, the chimpanzee, the orang-utan or the gibbon. So that's the idea of Haeckel.
This is Haeckel's study. He published many meticulously drawn illustrations of more than 100 animals and sea creatures, and many of them are kept in the museum here. Haeckel strove to promote Darwin's work on natural selection as an evolutionary force in the local region, including in education. Writing in 1877, almost 140 years ago, as an objection to political interference in educational policy, Haeckel wrote, "If Virchow insists with the utmost determination that the theory of descent must not be taught, what is to become of the supporters of that theory who, like myself, regard it as incontrovertible truth and teach it as sound theory? And at least 9/10 of all the teachers of zoology and botany in Europe are among its supporters from immutable conviction of its truth, as well as all morphologists without exception. Virchow cannot expect that these teachers should collectively renounce that which they believe to be immutable truth, and in its place set up the dogma of the Church as a basis of their teaching, in accordance with his wish." Haeckel's Welträtsel, the World Riddle, written in 1899, was the pinnacle of his work as a natural scientist. In it he described the universe in monistic terms as an indivisible whole governed by mechanistic laws. Everything is intelligible according to the laws of nature. He said there's no supernatural realm beyond these laws. Mind and free will are not attributable to some mystical extra jurisdiction. Human thought is also governed by these same mechanistic laws. Haeckel argued consciousness is attributable to a physiological and neurological system reducible to physics and chemistry. The human soul depends upon and supervenes upon the brain. However, Haeckel also introduced a metaphysical aspect to his approach. Attempting to explain the dynamism of life and of Darwinian natural selection and of human consciousness, he speculated that the nature of matter itself is active and, in recognition of the work of Fichte and Hegel, possessive of a kind of striving. Matter possesses an innate energy whereby the material substance of mind is simply a more complex form of the substance of inert substances. This innate energy is a primitive form of consciousness itself, which, combined together, enables the possibility of human consciousness. Haeckel also acknowledged the capacity of art to represent aspects of life and reality in ways that empirical knowledge cannot. However, he argued any conception of the faculty of aesthetics must be located in rational knowledge, and not in the superstitious dogmas of religion and other traditional forms of metaphysics, such as Cartesian dualism.
Haeckel said that existence is not divided between the mind and the physical, but is unified as a holistic being. He looked to evolutionary biology and naturalism in general as indicators of humanity's essential unity with organic life. Haeckel considered this approach to be a scientific version of Spinozism, except it was based on the notion of naturalism rather than pantheism. Haeckel speculated that all substance is animated, whereby the space between atoms is comprised of some form of ether that possesses a rudimentary form of consciousness. It's a theory similar to that of panpsychism, which I'll look at later. Haeckel was not the only figure based here in Jena to contribute to the rise of analytical methodology. Another important party here who studied physics at the university from 1910 was Rudolf Carnap. Records show he attended courses on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and was able to attend Frege's courses in mathematical logic and thereafter to communicate with Russell at Oxford. In 1926 he left Jena to join the University of Vienna and become an important figure in the Vienna circle of logical positivists. It's impossible for me to say a great deal about Carnap's work on logical positivism here, but I will introduce a few ideas that will be important to the ongoing scope of this inquiry. Logical positivism sought to justify empirical knowledge and the new naturalistic way of determining truth values by way of verification. The proof of a proposition, or a fact, is determined by its epistemic context, by the evidence that supports it. Logical positivism fused the work of Frege and Russell in logicism, whereby the laws of arithmetic and mathematics are reducible to logic by way of symbolic language and the use of quantifiers, with a positivist approach to empiricism. This means that to know something, it's necessary to be able to prove it, implying it has to be seen to make some difference to future experience. For instance, if I say the music playing in the background is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, then this knowledge claim can be verified by somebody else checking the music to be this particular work of Beethoven. Alternatively, if I say there's snow, then in my future experience or somebody else's future experience, it's possible to confirm there's snow. An unverifiable sentence is something that cannot be verified in the future. For instance, if I say the snow is inspired by God, the claim cannot be verified. If I say the Beethoven is sublime, or any other aesthetic quality, this is a non-empirical judgment and cannot be verified. According to verification theory, all statements that cannot be proved by way of verification are to be considered nonsensical. All aesthetics and ethics are essentially meaningless. This is a fierce attack on all the humanities, including social science, music and the arts and literature, although this was probably not the intent of Carnap and his colleagues. It was the metaphysics of Aristotle and Augustine and the skepticism of Descartes and Hume they were refuting, and most importantly, the epistemic constraints placed on empirical knowledge by Kant's transcendental epistemology. Actually, the logical positivists didn't claim all non-empirical knowledge is meaningless. There was one exception that would have pleased Frege. Verification theory accepts that there are some non-empirical statements that can make sense, provided they're logical tautologies. For instance, the proposition all bachelors are unmarried is verifiable analytically because if a person was married, they wouldn't satisfy the definition of being a bachelor. Similarly, numbers smaller than 10 are not bigger than 100 due to the axioms of mathematics. In all these cases, verification is assured by way of the definition of terms. Frege might have been happy to some degree, but it was not enough to placate a snowstorm of objections. One of those forceful refutations to Carnap's verification came not from social science or literature or art, but from Wittgenstein, who also had associations with both Oxford and Vienna. He claimed in absolute terms that logical positivism was just another in a long line of absolutely incoherent attempts to define absolutism. After all, he should know, he'd fallen into the same trap himself with his early Tractatus. He pointed out the verification principle could apply only at most to formal propositions, to statements about facts, which left out most of the rest of language that is not about facts, such as Schiller's sentimentalism, Goethe's year of learning, and Novalis' terrible heartache. Many others came up with objections to logical positivism too. My favourite has to do with the context of musical knowledge, as might be expected. If we seek to verify that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is for orchestra and choir, we need to know what an orchestra and a choir are in advance. This means that knowledge must come before verification. But given that knowledge requires verification, we have a situation where verification depends upon knowledge, which depends upon verification, which depends upon knowledge, which is something of a vicious regress and not terribly coherent either. Verification also doesn't cater for Putnam's twin earth, which places doubt on all notions of realism, and which I'll come to later. But for now, the point is this. If we can't be sure of knowledge per se, then we cannot actually verify anything. All we can verify is our own subjective experience. That contradicts the entire realist objective of the logical positivist project anyway. And there's more. The principle of verification is undermined by not being applicable to itself. It's not possible to verify that something can be verified. Having said that, it's also not possible to verify whether it's possible to verify that something can be verified. The solution to all of this came with the ideas of Karl Popper. He said that the only meaningful approach is to abandon the method of verifiability altogether and do the opposite, seek falsification. He argued that it's only ever possible to falsify a propositional statement or a scientific theory, not to prove it. But even the work of Popper couldn't stop the abuse. Another fierce critic of logical positivism was Willard Quine. He took the incoherencies to their natural conclusion and refuted the very notion of a distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions, that is, between logic-based and experience-based knowledge. He proposed a form of semantic holism, which he demonstrated by an indeterminacy of translation thesis, whereby no sentences mean the same thing exactly when translated into another language, or can have a verifiable condition alone. Not only is it not possible to verify the meaning of something, there's no such thing as meaning in isolation in the first place. But I'm getting ahead of things. Actually, the analytic tradition survived this onslaught of objections. Even though he'd left Jena, Carnap went on to do some very useful work indeed. He'd been a vocal pacifist and socialist, views that were deemed unacceptable by National Socialism. Consequently, he emigrated from Europe to the United States in 1935 and accepted a teaching position at the University of Chicago. During the next few years, his analytic approach led him to look in a new way at modal logic. His work anticipates the semantics of possible worlds developed by Saul Kripke, which has a lot to say about mind matter and the Weimar thesis, and which I'll look at in a future episode. Back in Europe, logical positivism fell out of favour after the Second World War, but its analytic approach remained popular, particularly in Britain. And it was just as important for the study of aesthetics as for anything else. One of the most important figures in analytical aesthetics during the second half of the 20th century was Frank Sibley.
He never lived or even visited Weimar or Jena, at least to my knowledge. He was a professor at Oxford University. Nevertheless, his ideas can be seen reaching back not only to the analytics of Carnap, and before that the logicism of Frege, but also to the work of Haeckel and before him to Schelling. Sibley takes the separation of the qualitative mechanical from the quantitative natural and applies the same principle to all aesthetic terms. Rather than write off all human experience as meaningless, Sibley stated that aesthetic considerations are not identified in a strict manner by non-aesthetic considerations. That's to say, the experience of mechanistic qualities cannot be paralleled with the empirical observation of the natural world. Aesthetic terms are always in flux, and, accordingly, it's impossible to pin them down. Sublimity and other affective states are legitimate and powerful experiences for which it's not possible to define fixed attributes. Sibley's analysis is that knowledge of non-aesthetic objects or events alone is not sufficient for the creation of aesthetic knowledge. Aesthetic terms are not governed by their conditions. No determination of non-aesthetic qualities can entail that a piece of music or a work of art or any quantitative experience has a particular aesthetic quality. For instance, it might be said that a certain flourish in the cello at the end of a piece of music creates a sense of resolution. The flourish can be determined to exist as an empirical entity with definable features in the sound or the sound wave. I can point at the notes in the score or at the amplitude of the sound. However, the perception of resolution, which is derived from the flourish, is not an empirical object. It's an aesthetic judgment, which is superimposed on the empirical phenomenon. It requires the application of aesthetic taste. Sibley stated that the sense of resolution in this case will be an emergent entity or concept. It's dependent on the cello flourish, even if there's no necessary causal link from cello flourish to resolution, as there might be, for instance, from articulating a note on a cello to hearing that note being played. Sibley argued that aesthetics disputes are not evidence of the meaninglessness of aesthetics at all, but an inevitable fact of human experience given that aesthetic properties are not dependent upon empirical facts. No verification methodology or rational procedure will ever be able to resolve this. We'll never be able to deduce the resolution from the flourish, and inductive methodologies, whether we look for regularities between flourishes and resolutions over a series of examples, are unlikely to help either. Sibley said objective reasoning is entirely the wrong approach for handling the aesthetic faculty. Aesthetic judgments, like all qualitative judgments, require explanation. If you go to the doctor with a pain in your toe because you've slipped in the snow, you'll always have to explain that pain to the doctor. Perhaps it's sharp and needle-like or dull and throbbing. You cannot plug a machine into your head that will fully characterize the quality of that pain. Actually, I recognize it might be possible in the future for sensors to link the emergent experience of sharp pain with certain nervous system and neural activity, and I'll look at neuroaesthetics later too. But even then, the experienced quality of that pain, the feeling of sharpness or dullness, will remain an enigma. And so it is with all qualitative experience. The hum of the doctor's new machines, the sound of the falling snow, or the pleasure or pain of listening to music. The outstanding question here, then, is whether all aesthetic experience is subjective. The question could be extended to all elements of human experience, of phenomenal qualitative experience, of understanding of language, of the serene and sombre, or the delicate and elegant, and of knowledge of scientific facts. Which brings me back to the Weimar thesis. What is the role of the transcendent mind in knowing anything? With that question on the tip of the tongue, at long last I've come to the fourth movement of my string quartet. I played a brief section at the beginning of this episode, and I'll finish with another passage in a short moment. Here, the second note is a minor sixth above the first, just as with the Tristan, and there's the same delirious yearning and desire for the lofty and ascendant. Yet this music is also an apotheosis of terror and anguish. Instead of hymning the Ode to Joy of Friedrich Schiller, as in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, this points to the arbitrary and incalculable world of Henze's Ninth Symphony. Immediately in this new music, there is fearful agitation. Unsparingly, beyond all compare, the trepidation here defiles the essence of sound itself.